you all so much for coming out on such a wet night. As I was saying in Clare last week, and it was also the really, really wet nights in Clare, that on a night like that, each person is worth 10, because you've sacrificed walking through the rain and everything to come out. So in 1918-19, Ireland lost over 20,000 people to the worst influenza pandemic the world has known. And I'm estimating that about 800,000 people suffered this influenza, which is about the same amount as have actually caught COVID or have been COVID cases in Ireland now. So at the very beginning of the pandemic, a man from the neighbouring county, Sam McConkey, estimated that about 32,000 Irish people could die from it if it wasn't properly managed. And we still think that that's what might have happened. And that would have been based on my 1918 statistics, given that the population has gone from 4,000 to 5,000, and that we're only talking about 26 counties then. So I think we're currently about 13,000 for the two parts of the island, which is really good. And it's because we all did what we had to do, particularly in the early part, and then got our vaccinations later. We're somewhere like America. They have 1.5 times the number died. That's 690,000 died in 1918-19, and it's well over 1 million now who died, even though we should have much better housing, much better healthcare, etc. So we were really responsible. So it silenced towns, cities and communities as it passed through. It stilled commerce and social life, and it brought with it an enormous amount of fear. This is something that would have been so unusual to talk about 4 years ago, but we know it so well now. There was no cure. And it punctured doctors' confidence in the new bacteriology coming from the findings of Lister and Pasteur and Koch. And that seemed to be having infectious disease on the run, because the rates were dropping quite quickly. It wasn't unusual to kill several members of one family. I think 10 is the record I have. And it was particularly scary because it often took young, strong adults, people we don't normally expect to die from a flu. And of course, people in the audience probably know well why it was called Spanish flu, but I'm always asked if not. It was because Spain wasn't involved in the World War, so they had no censorship. So when the young Spanish king, who was the ideal age that caught that flu, he was 32 years of age, Alfonso XIII got it, and 3,000 of his courtiers, and it was all over the newspapers. But there was censorship in the Irish and British newspapers and the Germans, etc., because they never wanted to weaken their hand in the war. And we know all too well, as a pandemic can do it, it inserted itself into every aspect of Irish life at a particularly crucial stage, as you've been working on for these the decade being now, what is it, how many years? 13 years or something like that? Happening time in Irish history. Rebellion in 1916, the promise of home rule seemed well and truly gone by 1918, and war. And then the conscription crisis emerged as we were heading inexorably towards independence. And it's really about this period when the conscription crisis is starting to happen and the flu is starting to happen, in that really curious synchronicity of history that I'm going to talk about now. Because the flu really gave a useful hand to the Sinn Fein network of professional and citizen propagandists who managed to adapt the disease as a political tool, sometimes just subliminally. They'll be saying, oh God, what happens if that flu comes around here, and what they've done to us. And then sometimes really quite deliberately, that it was active propaganda. Newspaper reports help us to identify 3 ways the independence movement harnessed the flu. One was when it killed cultural and, just so you can see it, political nationalists within communities. The other was when the treatment received by the Defence of the Realm Act, political prisoners suffering from flu in Belfast jail, and then the threat posed by flu to the leading members of Sinn Fein and the other anti-conscription campaigners who were interned in Great Britain under the alleged suspicion of a trumped-up German plot. And I'm going to really focus on that, but mention the other 2 first. So many of the internees had stood in the December 1918 general election, and this adds a further interest to their detention and their well-being, and particularly within their constituencies. And some sent speeches to be read at the pre-election rallies, often mentioning the conditions and the unjust nature, that they hadn't been tried or anything, they were just internees, and the health of the prisoners as well. So surveying the newspapers with nationalist sympathies shows that they carried alongside stories illustrating the government's ineptitude in dealing with the influenza crisis. Even the newspapers like the Kildare Observer, that were what we call castle papers, were saying, for goodness sake, what are the people in the Custom House doing about this? So their own are turning on them. There was also extensive obituaries and coverage of the funerals of Sinn Féin activists who died from the flu. And they used the opportunity provided by the epidemic to eulogise these victims, just people who died in the community from the flu, and to establish their credentials as what I call Fine Gaels, or true Irish patriots. And a typical example was the death report and obituary of James Corrigan, a 27-year-old teacher from Burke County Offaly. He taught Irish. He was secretary of the Offaly GA Association, the South Offaly Gaelic League. He was a member of Sinn Féin and the Irish Volunteers. He was captain of a championship-winning Offaly hurling team, and possessed of a great talent for organisation. That even as a young age, he had been the mainspring for athletic activity in the county, and an assiduous reviver of the native tongue, an officer of the Volunteers, a strict disciplinarian, and an ardent Catholic. So he was really a veritable all-round Fine Gael. So by establishing the cultural and political nationalism of the flu victims in their obituaries and at their funerals, propagandists were able to really harness their deaths to the Irish patriot funerary tradition. And framing the deaths of Irish nationalists to influence the opinions of the living against the government was really an art form in 1918. And even if the victims had died from a global pandemic that was completely out of the control of the British or any other government, the propaganda potential in the pre-election months was much too useful to ignore. Flu was used to highlight perceptions of the mistreatment of the Sinn Féin DRA prisoners in Belfast jail in a long-running and very public squabble between the Irish Chief Secretary, Edward Short, the General Prisons Board for Ireland, the prisoners and their lawyers. And this dispute was perceived by the General Prisons Board and others as being a major threat to prison security. And the dispute not only in Belfast, because convicted Sinn Féin prisoners in Cork, Galway, Limerick, Derry, Mountjoy and Waterford, who'd been granted ameliorations, they were waiting for transfer to a special section of the jail in Belfast, where it was proposed to keep them under conditions for well-behaved internees, but this move was suspended indefinitely when the flu broke out amongst the Dora prisoners in Belfast jail. And prison authorities, fearful that the suspension would lead to some sort of an attack on the prisons involved, moved extra guards onto those prisons. And all of this was informed by a very serious disturbance amongst the Republican prisoners in Crumlin Road with a special ameliorations in June 1918. So prison authorities were really well aware nationally how hot this situation is. On the 25th of October 1918, the Prisons Board felt it wise to report to the Under-Secretary James McMahon that there'd been a serious outbreak of flu in the jail, with 80 of the Dora prisoners infected. The Prisons Board medical member, Dr. McCormack, was sent to Belfast to confer with the prison's medical officer about how to deal with the outbreak. But a row really began when a solicitor for the prisoners, Mr. McGinn, wrote to the Chief Secretary, Edward Short, and asked the permission of 3 named doctors to treat Sinn Féin prisoners in Belfast prison. They wanted their own to treat them. So his letter had barely arrived on the 28th of October when there was a series of telegrams from various parties involved in the Sinn Féin propaganda operations and hitting the Chief Secretary's office as the conditions of the prisoners worst. They claimed that 111 prisoners were down with the flu, that their conditions were awful, that the men were locked in their cells with only dry bread and tea for food, that they were sleeping on the floors with poor quality bedding, and that they weren't getting good medical attention, that no nurses or hospital accommodation, and they wanted their own doctors admitted, doctors they could trust. And these allegations were published in newspapers around the country. The prison governor, William Barrows, the man I came to be very fond of as I was doing this research, I began to feel quite sorry for him. He reported by telephone to the Prisons Board on the 28th of October that there were these 111 Dora prisoners sick, and also 14 officers and 2 clerks, and that he'd employed 11 temporary warders. And the great number of sick was placing a great strain on the officers on duty, so they had to provide nursing as well, because there was a real shortage of nurses because of the war situation as well. And he asked for extra staff, and the Prisons Board sent in 3 extra warders the following day. Michal Costello, one of the Dora prisoners, he wrote a letter to his wife, Teresa Costello, from Clondalkin on the 5th of November 1918. But his letter was suppressed by Governor Barrows as he said it contained inaccurate information about the epidemic. But it really did appear to be quite well grounded in fact. And of course, you can get these online now. I don't know if you've been into those. They're great fun to read, if such things can be great fun, but they're really interesting to read, I suppose I should say. Sound more academic-y. Just a few lines, my dear Sissy, to let you know that the flu is raging here at its height. 16 patients are gone to outside hospitals. I am so far keeping clear of it. It's a very dangerous form of sickness: nose bleeding, terrible sweats, weakness, pain in the chest, horrible coughs, getting better and then getting worse. My God, you would pity the men in the cells with beads of sweat standing out in their faces. You can imagine what it would be in a home, but in a prison cell, it is absolute murder. No man is sent outside unless he is dangerously ill. That is when he has developed pneumonia. We are getting fairly well treated now, but there are 70 in the cells yet. They should be sent to a proper hospital. There are plenty of beds to be had in the Lisburn Road. That is the Union Hospital in Belfast. I actually lived beside there for 3 years. I found Murphy lying on the floor one morning at 7 a.m. and I found another prisoner bleeding to death. The latter is the worst case of the lot outside now. There's some bad cases here, but some men don't yet get any medicine on some days unless their own fellows find that he's not got it. The lads were very much neglected in the early stages. There's a day nurse and a night nurse here for the last few days, and now they're trying to kill us with kindness. I hope there'll be no more casualties, and please God there won't be. Tell all I was asking for them. Keeping yourself, Maureen, Kit and Maisie are well, remaining your lovely husband, Michal. So again, you know, he could well have had the flu, but he'd be trying to make his wife quite confident that he was okay. And you see this repeatedly with prison correspondents, you know, that they were sick in the hospital, but they try not to make the hospital worry. And equally, I think De Valera's family actually got completely sick with the flu, which I unfortunately missed for the book, but De Valera himself never got the flu. So, but they weren't writing in to say the family have got the flu, they're trying to keep it away from him. So the Sinn Féin prisoners conducted a series of protests in order to gain proper care for their colleagues who were sick with the flu. The General Prisons Board refused to permit the prisoners to receive private medical attention, instead directing the prison governor to improve the conditions under which the prisoners were kept. They were to get this extra medical care that he'd mentioned, and nursing care and proper beds and bedding and mattresses. The beds were taken away from them because they used them to riot, to break them up. And they'd use them to bang windows and kind of create noise to do this. The epidemic and the relaxation in the prison regime caused a lot of strain on the prison staff. Most of them were middle-aged because, again, a lot of the younger warders would have been away in the war, whereas the prisoners were generally younger. And with the new open cell door policy, the staff felt under threat from prisoners who could now potentially arm themselves with those bedposts. And prisons inspectors report in November said that 18 of the staff were ill with the flu and absent, and that the chief warder, Barrows, had lost his reason from the strain, so he'd had a nervous breakdown. Barrows' communications with the Prisons Board throughout November and December documented his fears about the possibility of violence breaking in the prison amongst the special prisoners when the relaxation of the rules necessitated by the flu outbreak eventually had to be reversed. And he wrote a letter to the board on the 7th of November, and he said, if I enforce the rules, it will be looked upon as oppression and will probably be exaggerated in the press and the correspondence. But under existing conditions, convalescent patients can and do exchange visits with each other in different wards at all hours up to midnight, and proper supervision is difficult to manage. But there are still a number of prisoners who are really sick, and it would not, in my opinion, be advisable to take any extreme measures just now. So the chairman of the Prisons Board, Max Green, and other board members agreed that Barrows should take a cautious report. And reporting back to the Under-Secretary McMahon, Green wrote that there was a great spirit of unrest amongst the special prisoners in Belfast, and the board had been informed that there was a similar spirit of unrest amongst other special prisoners around the country, and that they really should have them supplemented with a special military guard. When the epidemics appeared to have ended in December 1918, The board was considering the reinstigation of the pre-epidemic regime, and the prisoners used the opportunity to riot, using parts of the new beds that had been given for the flu treatment as missiles, and they conducted a rooftop protest and blockaded themselves into a section of the prison. They tore down doors and everything. And the pressure took such a toll on Burroughs that he suddenly took ill with an acute attack of cardiac vertigo on the 30th of December 1918 and was replaced by the governor of Maryborough prison, Horatio Chippendale. The Belfast prisoners' dispute continued into the spring of 1919 with another outbreak of flu there in March. The alleged mistreatment of the ill prisoners by the Belfast prison authorities and their political masters was really well publicised by the organisation, but ultimately only one prisoner died in the whole of Ireland during the flu pandemic, which is an incredible record and testament to the really good medical care they got. And she wasn't a political prisoner, she was somebody who was in for petty larceny in Derry, I think, and she died a day after she'd come in. But you can see in all the other prisons, Mountjoy, etc., that they're being very cautious. And that as soon as the prisoners get in any way sick, they're booting them off out to the Mater or whatever local hospital there is, so that they don't die in jail. The most interesting part of, I don't know what slide I have coming up next, of the Spanish flu and nationalist politics was in relation to the so-called German plot. In March 1918, a German spring offensive on the Western Front compelled the British government to consider extending conscription to Ireland. Of course, what's happened is that the Germans are able to concentrate their forces on the Western Front because they no longer have to fight on the Eastern Front because the Russians are in revolution and they've pulled out the war. So it looks like Germany is going to have the winning of the war, and they're really putting everything into to try and to beat the Allies. And the British government at long last think of introducing conscription to Ireland, even though their own say that, you know, there is no point. This is just going to end really badly. Irish Chief Secretary Henry Duke warned that he might as well conscript Germans as Irishmen. And others said that introducing conscription to Ireland should lead to chaos. David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, introduced a military conscription bill on the 9th of April. He delayed its application to Ireland, but the immediate response was to unify the somewhat disjointed broad spectrum of Irish nationalists into a national conscription resistance campaign. And within days, it was announced that the nationalist Joe Dowling had been arrested following his landing by a German submarine on the Clare coast. British intelligence started to investigate an alleged plot by the Germans to provide an expeditionary force to support another nationalist rising. So popular support for the anti-conscription movement escalated rapidly. Public meetings were held in Dublin and around the country. I think there was a few up here too, wasn't there? Good few that I should have looked at more. They drew large crowds. Duke was highly agitated. William Murphy notes, and Duke warns that the British cabinet that the Irish situation is critical. And on the foot of that advice, the regulations enacting DORA were amended on the 20th of April to allow, I've actually written down here interment, but it's internment, if individuals acted in a manner prejudicial to the public safety of the realm. Before that, they had to be tried. So on the 5th of May 1918, the government replaced Chief Secretary Duke and Lord Lieutenant Lord Wimborne with an Irish executive who were more prepared to play hardball with the Irish people. They wanted a team that would be more prepared to take harsh measures. And the anti-conscription campaigners were becoming increasingly popular. So Edward Short became Chief Secretary and Sir John French Lord Lieutenant, and the new executive rounded up prominent anti-conscription campaigners under this alleged suspicion of collusion with Germany. It's really hard to get the numbers on them defined. There's lots of, everybody has a slightly different list, and there's a lot of them coming and going. But initially, I think around 69 were arrested on the night of the 17th of May 1918, and more were arrested in the following days of months, and many of these were transported to Britain, where they were interned without charge. When Tommy Dillon, was he Professor of Chemistry? I'm trying to think in Galway. But when he was rounded up, Kathleen Lynn was actually in his house, and she put on an old shawl and a scarf and toddled out the door with a bad limp to escape. And of course, she then went working with the flu victims later on. The internees included, I'm not sure if I have this in the slide. Oh, yes, I have. 3 women who each had an almost iconic status in Irish society. On the left you see Constance Markievicz, in the centre you see Kathleen Clarke, and then on the right you see Maud Gonne McBride. And Clarke's arrest caused a particular outcry, as her 3 boys had already been left without their father when Tom Clarke was executed, and she was known to have a very weak heart and to be in very frail health. The women were sent to Holloway Jail in Islington. The men detained included Arthur Griffith and Eamon de Valera, who you saw on the earlier slide, and several journalists who worked on propaganda. They were making damn sure to get them out of the way, including Willie Brennan Whitmore from Wexford and also Robert Brennan from Wexford. And they went to Usk, to Birmingham, to Gloucester, to Durham and Lincoln and Reading. So Dev was in Lincoln, and the Flu never went to Lincoln. So Irish history is peppered with the stories of perceived British injustice towards Ireland's nationalist politicians, and the German plot very quickly becomes one of these. Even though Lord Wimborne suggested that evidence in support of the plot was really flimsy, nationalists portrayed it as yet another example of British hypocrisy, as Britain was fighting in a war to protect the freedom of small nations. The German plot became really a coup, not just for the perceived oppressor, but for the perceived oppressed. They won the propaganda war, because public opinion was swiftly persuaded by this propaganda, carefully pasted in friendly newspapers, like, for example, the Irish Independent, which Honor and I both worked for, and usually you'd find in most towns they would have one paper that was very prominently pro-nationalist, and at that time still one paper that would be pro-Dublin Castle. Joanna from Westport wrote to the interned Pisuru, first name, it's gone Paddy, is it? On the 24th of November 1918, "You're more of a power in Irish affairs than if you're out. We all love the felons of our land. You know now that the election fight is here, we must arouse the best feelings and sympathies of the nation. And the silence of the Sinn Féin leaders, because enforced, is more effective than any amount of ability from the platform." After an initial settling-in period, as terms and conditions were negotiated between the prisoners and the prison authorities and the Home Office, there's all this discussion going backwards and forwards, the terms were relatively relaxed, with the men and women treated more like civil detainees, but in a prison rather than a camp. Their correspondence is very rich, monitored by the postal censor, so we get to read that. And the communications from the internees carried to the press had been submitted through the press censor. And despite these instructions, uncensored news occasionally managed to get into the papers. The first wave of the flu broke out in mid-June, and they were arrested in May, shortly after the roundup. And 3 of the internees were medical doctors, Richard Hayes, Brian Cusick and H. Russell McNabb. There were repeated appeals in the Dublin and the regional papers for the release of the 3 to tend to flu patients during the crisis, and each of the local boards of guardians around the country, you very quickly tell what political shade they are. In Wexford, only the Wexford Board of Guardians, which was very unionist, didn't call for the release of these doctors. And there were also appeals for Kathleen Lynn, who had been evaded detention that time when she was visiting, actually it was Tommy and Geraldine Dillon, when Tommy Dillon was arrested, to be allowed to come off the run. So the flu epidemic, unpredictable and life-threatening as it was, naturally caused extra anxiety for people separated because of the German plot, and Sinn Féin sympathisers and the families of the internees wrote to newspapers and to the prisoners of their concerns that the prisoners, many of whom had already previously been in jail, so their health wasn't good, that they wouldn't be able to cope with the flu or an epidemic to arrive in their prisoners. And equally, those inside fretted about the health of loved ones at home. And the postal censor remarked that some of the prisoners' letters were showing a lot of depression about the ravages of the flu epidemic in Ireland. And it also shows the correspondence that the nationalist leadership and their families had really close friendships, like Kathleen Lynn's Terrace Diaries, which have just been published or just about to be published, going to be a wonderful book by Mary McAuliffe and Harriet Wheelock from the College of Physicians. I've read them. They're very, just really short entries. And she shows lots of frequent worries about Kathleen Clarke, who she refers to, I think, as Saoirse, and Maud Gonne and the Dillons. And ironically, Clark caught flu when she was actually released from Holloway because of her situation in February 1919, and she was treated by Milne. Gunn was released from Holloway in November 1918. She had TB, and she was ordered to stay in a sanatorium in Ipswich until further order. And Markovich was then released when the rest of them were released in March 1919. Tommy Dillon's wife Geraldine gave birth to their second daughter, Blonid, on the 26th of May 1918, and in her book, Honora Bralcon describes how in a hot June, mother and 2 infant daughters caught the Spanish flu. Dillon recalled, "I remember trying to nurse poor Blah, who was a month old, and got it badly with a temperature of 104 degrees. I would wake up to find myself singing, waking her up by singing to her to sleep in a loud voice." In mid-October, one of the internees, Offaly County Councillor Thomas Russell from Tullamore, was temporarily released from Birmingham because all 4 of his children were threatened with death by the flu. And before he arrived, his eldest son, Cecil, had collapsed into a coma and survived his father's arrival by just hours. He died on the 16th of October, and Russell, under the circumstances, wasn't asked to go back to jail. Kathleen Clark revealed a lot of this tension surrounding the disease in her autobiography. She said, "Then we read of the terrible epidemic of flu raging all over England and Ireland. In a letter from home, I got the news that some members of the family were already down with it. And for weeks after there was no letter, I was sick with anxiety, as you can imagine. What was wrong that I had no letters from home? Were they all dead? And at the end of the 5 weeks, I got a big bunch of the letters that had been held up in the censor's office. I wonder if the censor knew what suffering had caused me. The news was good. The family were neither dying nor dead, but some of them had had the flu," she wrote. Gunn and Markovich also expressed concern in their letters about Clark's health. And it's a bit, they talk down about her all the time because they're rather more upper market than them. Gunn had been determined to go on hunger strike, but was put off the idea when Clark and Markovich said they'd both join her in it if they did it. And Gunn said in her witness statement, "I knew it would kill Kathleen, and I tried to dissuade her, but they were so determined, so I gave up on that occasion." And she wrote to Hannah Sheehy Skeffington in October 1918, "We're very anxious about Mrs. C." She doesn't call her Kathleen. "No matter how strong her spirit is, it's clear that her health suffers gravely, and it's not surprising. As for Maud, I think lung trouble is always a treacherous malady and apt to recur when the condition of health is low." Both Gunn and Clark resented Markovich, expressing fears in their letters that might alarm their families back at home. Markovich is always pragmatic. She wrote to Jenny Wise Power that in Holloway the 3 were safer from flu inside than out, that there was no cause for alarm, that their cells had very large windows and very hot pipes, and that they'd been provided with quite decent winter clothes. They later discovered that they were in actually the VD ward, and this was why the conditions were actually quite good there. They went to grab a pile of much bigger towels, and the nurse screamed at them, "Don't touch that, they're for the other sort." So it wouldn't have done if they'd caught that in jail. In late November, several of the internees in Ulster caught the flu, and at first were nursed by their colleagues as the prison doctor was away at war. On the 1st of December, a resident doctor was provided, and by the following day, the invalids, the sick patients, were moved to hospital wards. On the 6th of December, a nurse was provided. On the 9th of December, this guy, Richard Coleman, died. His comrades carried his corpse out late at night in a torrent of rain over 2 prison yards to their wing of the prison. Coleman had really become a hero because of his part in the 1916 rebellion and in the hunger strike in which Thomas Ashe died. And he now became a martyr by dying for flu, and his timing couldn't have been better because the general election was being held on the 14th of December. So Sinn Féin immediately claimed his death as murder in prison. They moved so fast to capitalise on the present really handed to them by fate. And the pro-nationalist papers like the Irish Independent or whatever, I'm not sure I have the slide of that, yeah. gave columns and columns of coverage to the tragic circumstances of his death. A party advertisement on the front page of the leading daily newspaper, the Irish Independent, claimed that Coleman had joined the ranks of martyrs who died for Ireland, the last of a long list that began with Bailieborough and went down through Thomas Ashe and then finally to Richard Coleman, who died from flu. I'm not sure that ad is there. No, it's not. The postal censor noted that Coleman's death gave rise to hostile criticism in prison correspondence. Actually, is it there in that one? His brother outside in the time. His brother wasn't let in when he was dying. So they really made hay on that too. You know, that's particularly, I suppose, for the Irish way we have of liking to visit our dead when they're dying, and that maybe they didn't understand how important that was. So the postal censor noted that this death gave rise to hostile criticism in the correspondence, and they were again trying to exploit it as an instance of British humanity towards the detainees. J. O'Reilly to Mrs. O'Reilly on the 10th of the 12th, 1918 said, "Poor Dick Coleman, he's been hunted and persecuted more than any I know of, and he died in Usk prison the victim of the arch hypocrite that mouths about humanity and the rights of small nations. Oh God, how long must our people suffer? We sent him home to Ireland yesterday evening after being kept from Monday to convenience the coroner, who went through an obviously rehearsed farce called an inquest." And then from Mrs. Mellows, "I'm greatly upset to hear of poor Coleman's death and of his having gone to his long-earned rest. That most human of governments can torture him no longer. He's now joined that noble band of martyrs in heaven." So a lot of this correspondence openly blames the British authorities for Coleman's death, rather than attributing his death to a disease about which the British or nobody else could do anything about at the time. Bernard Flannan writes to Bridget O'Flanagan, "Although the authorities say his death was caused by the flu, that's not taking the responsibility off them. Thomas Ashe was murdered and forcibly fed. Poor Coleman was left to die in the want of proper treatment in those filthy cells, and his brother at the door. And Richard was gone when he was admitted. Oh, the savages. But however, he died for a good cause, for the love of his country. What all our brave boys are ready to do, as I say often, the more they arrest, and what is more, the more they murder, the stronger we are. But who knows what may turn up. Perhaps they want to kill more of you with the flu, by the way." Stafford writes to Kathleen Clark in Holloway, "I expect you hear they finished Dick Coleman, RIP, in Usk jail last Monday. All Ireland mourns him today. He was murdered just as they murdered Thomas Ashe, only in a different manner." And De Valera had written to his wife Sinead the previous day, "Poor Dick Coleman has, I see, gone to join his comrades on the other side. They're going one by one, but I know no greater consolation they could have than their being granted their deaths are fresh embers to the flames that they lovingly tended during their life. Fingal, which is where Dick was from, has contributed more than its share. May God grant Ireland no ends of sun like brave, gentle Dick." Frank Gallagher, who was working for the interned Sinn Féin Director of Publicity, Robert Brennan, at the time, really evaluated Coleman's death from its use as propaganda. He said he was but 27 years of age, he was handsome. It was as if a goodly knight had fallen in a crusade. The people's tears came easily for him. The inquest disclosed the utter neglect of the sick in Usk prison. The disclosure horrified all who had men in prison. The morning after the inquest, canvassers sought out those who were still doubtful and put questions to him. How could any but the heartless stand aside now? All over Ireland that night, the D's, canvass tallies for doubtful, F for and A for against, the D's were being rubbed out. Coleman's body was brought back to Dublin on the 13th of December, arriving from Kingstown or Dunleary Port into Westland Row or Pearse Street Station, where his family and a crowd of 1,000 people waited, and the coffin was carried on the shoulders of the Irish Volunteers into St Andrew's Church, which is next door. I had the great privilege of filming that for a radio programme one day, so we had to go in and wait for the train station and try and get a crowd, to make noise and things like that, to try and recreate what had happened. So that evening, the final election rally was held in Dublin's O'Connell Street, with Sinn Féin banners and posters newly draped with black mourning ribbons. Frank Gallagher described the scene with each of the city constituencies represented by its own speakers in a wagonette, so they had 9 up and down the whole length of O'Connell Street. Down the whole length of the great thoroughfare, the 9 city meetings were held, and each flew a tricolour with a black cross on every one for Dick Coleman. Thousands wore the enamel badges with their candidate's photograph, now draped in black crepe. The mourning colours, of course, were for Coleman, but also resounding of the losses represented by the 1916 rebellion backdrop of O'Connell Street. And the leading players in the rally, as Gallagher points out, were a lot of the women of 1916. Mrs. Pearce was there, Mrs. Cant, and the others of the 1916 were there too, Gallagher says. And in her diaries, Kathleen Lynn refers to it as the most memorable day before the poll, a wonderful evening in O'Connell Street. Which was her partner, Madeleine French Mullen, and I got to stand in a break. The flags and the banners and the torches were a sight to see, a lovely moonlight night. On election day itself, the Evening Herald carried detailed instructions from the Sinn Féin headquarters at 6 Harcourt Street, telling a long list of groups, including Coleman's fellow employees at the New Ireland Assurance Company, the Irish Volunteers, Common Amon, the Irish Women's Franchise League, what role they were to play in the whole funeral procession. So that literally every street lined or marching it all the way out to Glasnevin. So there was 25,000 workers altogether from the Trades Council and this huge big rally that they did, and everybody had been instructed to attend the funeral in full force. And this level of stage management really shows that the organisation was really keen to exploit the opportunity of Coleman's funeral to make an impression on the government and on the electorate. He was going to have the classic Patriot funeral with the streets of the second city in the Union as a backdrop. But state management alone didn't explain the 15,000 who turned out, or stage management, in a rain-stricken Dublin in his honour. Sean McConville argues the hearse was led through the streets by 60 volunteers and 50 priests, a long line of carriages, including the Lord Mayor O'Neill, and several hundred more volunteers in formation, and then all those people lining the streets all the way to Glasnevin as well. So that was in the papers on the day of the election, and then the day after, the funeral itself took place. So when the election results came in, Sinn Féin, of course, had that resounding victory in the election, winning 73 seats. In Dublin, they'd been expected to take 9 of the 11 seats, and they took 10. Desmond Fitzgerald took the 10th. He had flu as well. A tribute to the inexhaustible energy of his wife Mabel, who managed his campaign while Desmond was interned. O'Hegarty believed the vote was reactionary. He said the victory of Christmas 1918 was not a victory of conviction, but of emotion. It was a victory occasioned less by any sudden achievement by the majority of a belief in Ireland as a nation than by the sudden reaction against various acts of English tyranny. And whether Coleman's death and the way he was presented to the electorate as this kind of martyr for the cause was effective in increasing the vote for Sinn Féin is entirely open to speculation. Robert Brennan, Sinn Féin Director of Publicity and also Director of Elections until his internment in Gloucester 3 weeks before the election, claimed that he'd predicted the number of seats several weeks before and said that Coleman's death had really little impact on the floor, on the vote. And in a pamphlet published after the release of the prisoners in 1919, Sinn Féin claimed that Coleman's death was murder and that it had contributed to the election cause. At the end of February, more political prisoners, this time at Gloucester and Durham, were reported to be suffering from the flu. And at the beginning of March, 5 of 11 political prisoners in Durham jail were ill. I'm not sure what I have on the next slide. Okay. Oh, that's the ad there, you see? Brian Brewer at the top, then the Earl of Desmond, Shane O'Neill, Hugh O'Donnell, Owen Rowe, Bishop McMahon, Father Sheehy, Archbishop O'Hurley, John Murphy, I'll take that one, Wexford woman, Lord Edwards Fitzgerald, Wolfe Tome, Emmett, Pearce, Conley, Ash, and finally Coleman, who dies from the flu. So this is the kind of way that they were spinning it. And this was an ad, Independent at the time, the front page, as Honor and I know, was all advertisements. So that was the best thing they could do, because it made the top left-hand corner, that ad, and they could have seen it really easily. So Arthur Griffith, in March, when 5 of the 11 political prisoners in Durham were ill, Arthur Griffith sent a message that the families of the men in Gloucester jail suffering from the flu shouldn't be alarmed. Frank Drohan had been one of those nursing the flu patients in Usk when Dick Coleman died, and he caught the flu himself in Gloucester. And he said, I remember the nurse coming around to check my temperature and my pulse, and I noticed her making an involuntary exclamation when she checked the temperature, and she was writing on the chart. And I said to the lads, beside me, I must be bad. I climbed up to have a look and saw that it was 104. And he says, I was kind of in a trance for about 3 days, but delirium, I suppose. Darrell Figgis was home on parole, told an Irish Independent reporter that many of the prisoners were indeed weak from that long confinement, and that the latest victims seemed to him to be the fittest of the lot, because often this flu actually hit people with really strong immune systems, a thing called a cytokine storm, that the body kind of overreacts when it's stronger. He said the prisoners were fed the same food as the convicts. Now, Figgis is well known for saying more than his prayers, so we don't know about that. And that their cells were like ice houses. But the situation was bad. Robert Brennan recalled a warder who's been afraid of catching the flu, told them that when it reached Gloucester, the people in the town were dying like flies. And to Brennan's surprise, the man who told them that, the warder who told them that, was dead from flu the next morning. The authorities really acted prudently. They sent the very sick prisoners out to nursing homes, and Brennan wrote that the prison stank of plague. By doctor's order, we were allowed to exercise in a larger ground where we could play rounders, and we were served with doses of a particularly potent tonic, like all the tonics had alcohol in them, each evening just before lockup time. The flu sometimes gave a much needed opportunity for light relief. J.K. O'Reilly protested that the doctor had prescribed him whiskey instead of tonic because he was allergic to the tonic. And at Arthur Griffith's instigation, the internees refused to go back to their cells at bedtime until he got the prescribed medicine, the whiskey. And after a standoff with the chief warder, the governor was called, and he came in a monkey suit. He was in from a party somewhere, and he was a bit tipsy himself. And under pressure and repeated teasing from Griffith, he brought out a bottle of whiskey. And when the prisoners saw the whiskey, they realised it was Dunville's whiskey from Belfast, in a bottle that had been sent to Sean McEntee at Christmas, and he hadn't been given. So McEntee says, lads, that's mine, go get your mugs. And they drank the whole bottle. And he said it was a great night, as many of the internees were teetotalers, so that any of them who drank got a good drop of it. So some of the prisoners' families came to nurse them and found the conditions very inadequate, even though the authorities had moved them to Beaufort Buildings, a private nursing home in Gloucester. And again, Honor O'Bralcon tells of Geraldine Plunkett Dillon arriving at the nursing home where there was 20 men in one room and 8 in another, really closely packed. And Tommy, her husband, was one of the most seriously ill. And she said that this guy, Pierce McCann, had become violent with the fever, which wasn't an unusual side effect. He was hitting his head off a wall, and that was very common. Headaches were so bad that they'd just do anything to get rid of the pain. McCann came from wealthy farming stock in Tipperary, and he was newly elected MP for Tipperary East. He got pneumonia. This was really common because, of course, there was no antibiotics at the time. And he was isolated from the rest of the patients. And Robert Brennan, who had been released from Gloucester, told an Irish Independent reporter, most of us were really astonished that McCann's condition had grown worse. He was one of the strongest men in the prison. He excelled in the games of handball and rounders. But confinement told more upon him than the others because he was so used to outdoor life and exercise. During the anti-conscription campaign, he'd been cycling 70, 80 miles to rallies, huge distance. He was a sportsman. And he pestered the prison doctor, asking over and over again, could this thing kill if it infected? And the doctor told him it was quite possibly would. And so McCann said if any precautions were being taken, and he subsequently complained that nothing was done to spread the epidemic. And Brennan said he really did seem to be very down about it, and he thought therefore maybe a bit more vulnerable to it. So the government were so afraid of any more adverse publicity that they decided to release the prisoners, and they staged a staggered release. And yet the impression is often given that Pierce McCann actually died in jail. He died out in that nursing home. He was only 35. His loss is a major shock. He was renowned for his athleticism. He was a handsome hero who was very popular with the women. I've read a lot of his love letters in the National Library. And the circumstances and timing of his death again play straight into the welcoming hands of the Sinn Fein propaganda machine. The public perception is that he died in captivity, even though he'd actually been released. The funeral Sinn Fein orchestrated for McCann surpassed even the excesses of Coleman's. 10,000 people follow the hearse to the Pro Cathedral in Dublin, processed down to Houston or Kingsbridge station with the members of the New Dáil marching behind. His body was taken by train to Thurles for burial with the carriage he was in draped in an enormous Sinn Féin flag. The crowd stood in the platforms of the stations and slowed down going through the stations, and they'd pay homage to him. And priests and orators then at the funeral laid the blame for the death of another gallant young Fine Gael at the hands of the government. Tipperary Star wrote, "Our latest hero martyr, whose sinless, stainless soul has freed itself and his great fearless spirit has gone forth amongst a nation's grief and sorrow, worthy indeed to be linked with Ash and Coleman." So again, it was really good timing. The Sinn Féin propagandists were able to really push home this message of unjust treatment of the British nationalists and to create the illusion, which they didn't try to hide, that he'd still been in jail when he died, which wasn't true. Post-flu malaise, there was a long flu syndrome, just like we have long COVID, may have affected the post-release performance of some of the internees. And again, Sinn Féin said this in the pamphlet, that a lot of them never went back into politics afterwards. I wonder too if the flu contributed to the collapse of Arthur Griffith's health. He caught flu, but against all the prevailing advice, he insisted on fighting it on his feet. Pádraig Colum wrote that Dennis McCullough was really startled by Griffith's appearance one morning. He roared, "You've got influenza." And "I can handle it," said Griffith. "How?" He said, "Quinine." "How much have you taken?" "The whole bottle, and you're only supposed to take 2 tablespoons at a time." So quinine is quite a strong toxin. If you take too much of it, it can turn you blind. It can make your eyes pop out. Sorry, not pop out, but your eyes will start to get protuberate, and that's what happened with his. So his veins were sticking up, and his eyes were sticking out, and he thought Griffith was as likely, McCullough, to collapse from the remedy as from the disease. He had a reputation for his physical strength and witness because of his early gymnastic training. He had a deformity of some kind, regular cycling and his daily swim in the 40-foot. And he was insisting on fighting the flu on his feet to set an example. And I wonder, did that actually contribute to his premature death in August 1922? We were saying he bent down to do a shoelace. He'd had a bit of a breakdown in 22, and he was in a nursing home somewhere, was it Marion Square, I think, or somewhere near there, and he bent down to do his shoelace, and an artery in his neck severed, which apparently is a really common way of dying. So the pandemic can cast quite long shadows, but I don't think his health was ever the same again. So historians writing about Irish politics until this time have tended, when Sean McConville and Willie Murphy's important books on political imprisonment came out, they would ignore the flu, but they did mention it in their work. And then I did more on it. Will was really generous, giving me lots of his PhD and other stuff that hadn't been published to include it in my book. But the elements of the political station most influenced by the flu epidemic, conscription, the German plot, and the 1918 election, combined, as P.S. O'Hegarty wrote, to throw more and more persuasion over in the country to Sinn Féin. Flu really proved the theory promoted by Sinn Féin that the conditions under which the prisoners were being kept was hazardous to their health. And Will Murphy described imprisonment as one of the fundamental ways in which nationalists identified themselves as rebels and shaped their resistance, and that imprisonment, he describes the term he uses, making the flesh bondage of their country. Flu amongst the internees and the political prisoners in British and Irish jails, at the very least, enhanced the opportunity to publicise that bondage and to play on public opinion at a really crucial time in Irish history. So thank you.